To begin our journey, let us turn our attention to the verdant, humid forests of what is now southwestern Nigeria, a place where the air hangs thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. Here, far removed from the clamor of European capitals and the dusty caravan routes of the Sahara, a city rose from the wilderness, not of stone, but of mud, wood, and an unquenchable obsession with a single metal, bronze. This was the city of Benin, or more accurately, the Kingdom of Benin, and its story is one inextricably linked with art, empire, and the strange, quiet power of brass and copper. Imagine, if you will, the daily life of a person in 14th century Benin. Their world was one of meticulous order. The city itself, a marvel of engineering, was surrounded by a colossal series of earthworks and moats, a kind of pre-industrial fortress that stretched for miles. To an outsider, these walls were imposing, a silent promise of the power held within. But to the Bini people, they were simply the boundaries of their cosmos. Inside, life was governed by a strict hierarchy, at the apex of which sat the Oba, the divine ruler, a figure so sacred he was rarely seen by his subjects. His power was absolute, yet it was not a power wielded in isolation. Beneath him were the palace chiefs, the city chiefs, and a complex network of guilds and secret societies, each with a specific role in maintaining the delicate balance of the kingdom. The kingdom's wealth, however, was not built on gold or precious stones, but on a more humble, yet equally significant, commodity, brass. While the Bini did not mine the metal themselves, they were masters of its transformation. Through trade with the Hausa and other northern groups, they acquired copper and zinc, which they then melted down to create the shimmering, golden-hued alloy that would define their culture. The bronze casters of Benin, members of the exclusive Iginaramwan Guild, were not mere artisans, they were priests of their craft, their workshops tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Their work was not for the masses. It was exclusively for the Oba and his court, each piece a historical record, a spiritual vessel, or a tribute to the divine lineage of the ruler. The art they produced was unlike anything seen before. The Benin bronzes, as they are now known, were not cast in the lost wax method for purely aesthetic reasons. Each plaque, each bust, each intricately carved figure was a historical document. Imagine a plaque depicting the Oba riding to battle, his face calm and resolute, surrounded by his loyal warriors. It wasn't just a picture, it was a chronicle of a military campaign. Another might show the Oba in a ritual, surrounded by priests, his hands holding symbolic objects. This was a record of a religious ceremony, a moment in the spiritual life of the kingdom. These bronzes were the kingdom's official history, an archive cast in metal, a physical manifestation of memory. They captured moments of triumph, of ritual, and of conquest, preserving them for an eternity. The artistry was breathtaking. The level of detail was extraordinary, from the individual scales on a python to the intricate patterns on a chief's tunic. To a modern eye, these pieces are marvels, but to the Bini, they were more. They were the living testament to the Oba's power and the prosperity of the kingdom. Each piece told a story, from the arrival of the first Portuguese traders, clad in strange, baggy clothes and carrying firearms, to the countless rituals performed to appease the gods and ensure the kingdom's survival. They were a continuous, evolving narrative of a people and their rulers. It was this very obsession with bronze that led to one of Benin's most fascinating and enduring stories. The Oba was more than just a king, he was a living god, a descendant of the mythological founder of the dynasty. His power was believed to be so immense that even his shadow was sacred. To maintain this divinity, the city's artists were tasked with casting an endless stream of commemorative works. But one particular event, a moment of profound significance, became a recurring motif in their art. The legend, passed down through generations and solidified in bronze, tells of an ancient Oba who, in a moment of great crisis, was saved by a leopard. The animal, a symbol of royal power and ferocity, was not just a creature of the wild, it was an omen, a sign from the gods. This event became so deeply ingrained in the kingdom's mythology that the Oba's palace was believed to be inhabited by spirit leopards, and their likenesses were cast in countless bronze plaques and figures, standing guard over the royal court. The bronze casters, the guardians of this narrative, faced a unique challenge. Their work required immense skill, patience, and a deep understanding of both the physical properties of the metal and the spiritual significance of the images they were creating. They were not just artists, they were keepers of the sacred, their hands shaping not just metal, but the very history of their people. They poured their knowledge, their skill, and their very souls into each piece, creating a body of work that would, centuries later, reveal the intricate, complex, and beautiful story of a lost kingdom. The bronzes of Benin are a window into a world that no longer exists, a world of ritual, power, and an unshakable belief in the divine right of their rulers. Yet, they leave us with a question. If these plaques and busts were the official history of the kingdom, a chronicle of its triumphs and its rulers, what were the stories left unrecorded, the daily lives of the common people, the quiet moments of peace and struggle that were never deemed worthy of being cast in bronze? The question lingers. What stories were left uncast? What lives existed beyond the polished surface of the bronze plaques? As we delve deeper into the heart of the Benin Kingdom, we must turn our attention away from the art itself and towards the social and political machinery that powered its creation. The bronze casters of the Iganaramwan Guild were an essential part of this system, but they were only one cog in a vast and intricate machine. To truly understand the power of the Oba and the obsession with bronze, we must first understand the daily life within the royal court, a world of ritual, hierarchy, and quiet, unyielding power. The Oba, or Omo no Benito, was not just a monarch, he was a living deity, a direct link between the Bini people and the spiritual world. His public appearances were rare, and when he did emerge, he was often shielded from direct view, a symbol of his sacred status. He lived within the Aroegwades, the sprawling palace complex that was a city within a city. The palace was not just a residence, it was the political and spiritual heart of the kingdom. It housed a labyrinth of courtyards, shrines, and halls, each with a specific function. Here, the Oba held court, received foreign dignitaries, and performed the countless rituals necessary to ensure the prosperity and well-being of his kingdom. Daily life in the palace was a ballet of protocol and tradition. The Oba was attended by a massive retinue of courtiers, chiefs, and servants, each with a precisely defined role. The Urho Oba, the palace chiefs, were responsible for the daily administration and maintenance of the royal household. The Yuka, the city chiefs, oversaw the governance of the wider city and its surrounding provinces. There were also the Abiwe chiefs, the royal lineage chiefs, who were responsible for the spiritual well-being of the Oba and his family. This system, with its checks and balances, was designed to ensure that the Oba's power, while absolute, was not wielded in a vacuum. It was a structure built on tradition and a deep respect for the established order. One of the most fascinating aspects of court life was the role of the Iwil, the palace scribes. While not literate in the European sense, they were the oral historians of the court. They memorized vast genealogies, royal decrees, and the history of the kingdom, passing it down from generation to generation. Their memories were the uncast history of Benin, the stories that were not deemed grand enough for bronze but were essential for the smooth functioning of the state. They were the human archives, their minds holding the detailed narratives of the kingdom's past, present, and future. The obsession with bronze was not merely an aesthetic preference, it was a form of political communication. When the Oba commissioned a new plaque, a new bust, or a new figure, he was not just commissioning a work of art. He was commissioning a historical record, a propaganda tool, and a spiritual object all at once. The plaques, with their detailed depictions of military victories, were a clear message to rivals and subjects alike. The Oba was powerful, his army was formidable, and his rule was divinely sanctioned. The busts of past Obas, often placed on royal altars, served a dual purpose. They were objects of ancestor worship and a physical representation of the unbroken line of succession, a powerful symbol of legitimacy. The arrival of the Portuguese in the late 15th century added a new dimension to this system. The Portuguese, seeking trade and new markets, were initially impressed by the grandeur of Benin and its organized society. They traded firearms, coral, and brass manillas, bracelets used as currency, for ivory, pepper, and slaves. The Oba, ever the shrewd ruler, saw an opportunity. The imported brass, more plentiful and of a different composition than the local supply, fueled the artistic engine of the kingdom. The artists of the Iganaramlan Guild had a new source of raw material, and the Oba had a new medium for his historical narrative. The plaques of this period are a fascinating study in cultural exchange, depicting Portuguese soldiers, traders, and even priests in intricate detail, their strange clothes and unfamiliar weapons captured forever in metal. Yet, as the trade intensified, the dynamic shifted. The focus of the Portuguese shifted from pepper and ivory to human beings, a commodity they found to be more profitable. The Kingdom of Benin, like many others in the region, became deeply entangled in the transatlantic slave trade. While the Bini were not the primary suppliers, their involvement was significant, and it introduced a new level of violence and instability to the region. The very wealth that fueled the bronze casting industry, the brass manillas traded for goods and people, was now tied to a system of unimaginable suffering. The power of the Oba, once seen as a source of order and stability, was now also a conduit for this new, insidious form of commerce. The bronze plaques, which had once celebrated military victories against neighboring tribes, now quietly documented the arrival of the European traders who would reshape the continent. They show men in strange hats and long coats, carrying guns and crosses, but they do not show the human cost of the trade that they facilitated. This brings us to a crucial, and perhaps uncomfortable, question. For all the beauty and historical significance of the Benin bronzes, what do they tell us about the human toll of the empire they chronicled? Was the splendor of the Oba's court and the brilliance of his artists built on a foundation of human suffering? The question of human cost hangs in the air, a shadow over the shimmering beauty of the Benin bronzes. While the plaques capture moments of triumph, they remain silent on the suffering, the loss, and the slow, insidious erosion of a kingdom's sovereignty. The final chapter of Benin's story, one that led to the scattering of its bronze treasures across the globe, is a stark example of how a history, so meticulously curated in metal, could be unmade in a moment of violent conflict. As the 19th century drew to a close, the British Empire's influence in the region was growing. Their interests, driven by trade and the desire to control the lucrative palm oil and rubber markets, increasingly clashed with the independent spirit of the Benin Kingdom. The Oba at the time, Ovan Ramwanad Besai, was a formidable ruler who resisted British attempts to assert control over his territory. He saw the British as little more than opportunistic traders and was wary of their motives. His refusal to sign a treaty of protection, and his insistence on maintaining the kingdom's traditional trade monopolies, put him on a collision course with British colonial ambitions. The conflict reached its tragic climax in 1897. A small British delegation, led by Acting Consul General James Phillips, attempted to enter Benin City despite being warned that their visit coincided with a sacred festival and that no foreigners were permitted to enter. The Bini, fearing a British attack and misinterpreting the delegation's intentions, ambushed and killed all but 2 of the party. The British, interpreting this as an act of unprovoked aggression, immediately declared a punitive expedition against the Benin Kingdom. What followed was a military campaign of overwhelming force. A large contingent of British Marines and soldiers, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, marched on Benin City. The Bini, fighting with traditional weapons, were no match for the technologically superior British forces. The earthworks that had protected the city for centuries proved useless against artillery fire. The British forces entered the city, and what they found both amazed and horrified them. They were struck by the intricate, well-organized city and the artistry of the palace, but they were also appalled by the evidence of human sacrifice they encountered at the Oba's altars. To the British, this was not just a military conquest, it was a civilizing mission, a righteous war to end what they saw as barbarism. During the occupation of the city, British forces looted the palace, seizing thousands of artifacts, including the famous Benin bronzes, from the royal treasury and ancestral altars. These were not seen as works of art or historical documents, but as war booty. They were loaded onto ships and sent back to Britain, where they were eventually sold off to museums and private collectors to pay for the cost of the expedition. The Oba, Ovan Ramlin, was exiled to Calabar, where he lived out his days, a king without a kingdom. The city of Benin was burned, and its centuries-old traditions were shattered. The looting of 1897 marked a profound and tragic end to a magnificent chapter of history. The bronze plaques, busts, and figures, which had once served as the kingdom's official archive, were now scattered across the world, their historical and spiritual context stripped away. They became objects of study in European museums, their creators anonymous and their original purpose lost to most observers. Yet, in their dispersion, they also became something else, a testament to the sophistication and artistic genius of a civilization that had been systematically dismantled. The story of the Benin bronzes is a complex one, a narrative that begins with the quiet artistry of a guild and ends with a global conversation about cultural heritage, repatriation, and the legacy of colonialism. Today, the call for the return of these artifacts to Nigeria is louder than ever, a movement aimed not just at reclaiming objects, but at restoring a sense of history and identity. The bronzes, once a silent chronicle of the Oba's power, have now become a symbol of a different kind of power, the power of a people to reclaim their past. They force us to reflect on a fundamental question: who owns history? Is it the one who creates it, the one who preserves it, or the one who takes it? The story of the Benin Kingdom and its bronze walls is a quiet reminder that the most significant battles of history are often fought not with swords and guns, but over memory and the objects that hold it. Our journey now takes us to a different corner of Nigeria, a place of quiet, rolling hills and small, scattered villages. Here, the story is not of a grand, walled city like Benin, but of an accidental discovery that unearthed a civilization lost to time. We are in the small town of Igbo in southeastern Nigeria, and our story begins not with a royal edict or a military campaign, but with the mundane, repetitive act of a man digging a well in his own backyard. In 1938, a man named Isaiah Anazi was digging a cistern in his compound when his shovel struck something hard. He was not looking for history, he was looking for water. But what he found was something far more precious. Buried just a few feet beneath the earth were intricate bronze artifacts, unlike anything seen before. They were of a quality and style that immediately suggested a high level of artistic and metallurgical skill, yet they bore no resemblance to the famous works of Benin or Ife. This was a mystery waiting to be solved, a quiet, almost unassuming secret that the earth had held for nearly 1,000 years. The discovery was reported to the colonial authorities, and a subsequent archaeological excavation was led by Thurston Shaw. The dig revealed not one, but 3 distinct sites: Igbo Isaiah, the original site of Anazi's discovery, which contained a cache of bronze objects; Igbo Richard, believed to be a burial chamber of a high-status individual; and Igbo Jonah, a ceremonial pit. The artifacts found at these sites were a revelation. They included bronze and copper alloys, pottery, beads, and textiles, all dating back to the 9th and 10th centuries AD. This placed the Igbo civilization as one of the earliest known examples of complex society in the region, a contemporary of the great empires of the Sahel, yet entirely distinct from them. The sheer artistry of the artifacts was breathtaking. They included a ceremonial vessel shaped like a leopard, or roped pot, and countless ornate bronze figures and ornaments. The lost wax casting technique used by the Igbo people was incredibly sophisticated, even more so than that of Benin, with some pieces so delicate they seemed to defy the limits of the medium. The level of detail was astonishing, from the individual strands of a rope to the intricate patterns on a serpent. These were not works of simple craftsmanship, they were the product of a highly specialized and artistically advanced society. But who were these people? Unlike Benin, with its oral traditions and written history in bronze, the Igbo civilization left no such records. They did not build stone cities or leave behind great walls. Their society, it seems, was not based on military conquest or a centralized monarchy. The artifacts suggest a different kind of power structure, one based on ritual, trade, and the spiritual authority of a priestly class. The burial chamber at Igbo Richard, for example, contained a seated figure of a man adorned with thousands of beads, intricate regalia, and ceremonial bronze objects. This was not a warrior king, but a ritual leader, a person whose power derived from his connection to the divine. The source of the metal also presented a puzzle. There were no known sources of copper in the immediate vicinity of Igbo. The metal for these beautiful objects must have been traded from far away, perhaps from the Sahara or even further afield. This implies that the Iboakwa people were part of a vast, long-distance trade network that stretched across the continent, a network that allowed them to acquire the raw materials for their art. They were not an isolated people, they were connected to a world of commerce and exchange. Their wealth derived not from conquest, but from their position as a center of trade and ritual. This raises a fascinating, and as yet unanswered, question. What was the source of this wealth? What were they trading in return for the copper and other valuable materials that allowed them to create such masterpieces, and why did this sophisticated civilization simply disappear from the historical record? The mystery deepens. The Iboakwa civilization, with its stunning bronze art and far-reaching trade networks, seems to have vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the evidence of its wealth and artistry. The artifacts found at the three sites, Ibo Isaiah, Ibo Richard, and Ibo Jonah, tell a story not of a vast, sprawling empire like Benin, but of a quiet, wealthy, and ritual-focused society. The answer to what they were trading lies in a subtle, yet significant, detail found among the thousands of artifacts, beads. The excavation of the sites yielded an incredible quantity of glass and carnelian beads, some of which were so fine they appeared to be the product of an advanced glass-making industry. While the source of these beads is still a matter of debate, it's highly probable that they were not made locally. The sheer number of them, and their presence in high-status burials, suggests that they were a form of currency or a high-value commodity. The Iboakwa people likely acted as middlemen in a long-distance trade network, exchanging goods from the forest regions, such as ivory, cola nuts, and perhaps even slaves, for valuable materials like copper, glass beads, and carnelian from the trans-Saharan trade routes. This would explain their access to the raw materials for their bronze art without having to mine them themselves. Their power, therefore, was not based on conquest but on their position as a central hub of commerce and spiritual authority. The burial site at Ibo Richard is perhaps the most telling. It was a burial chamber for a high-status individual, likely a titled man or a priest-king, whose body was interred in a seated position, adorned with a bronze crown and surrounded by hundreds of thousands of beads. The presence of a fly-whisk candle, a symbol of authority, and ceremonial staff heads, suggests that this individual held a position of great spiritual and political importance. The chamber also contained a variety of bronze vessels, some decorated with intricate patterns of serpents and insects, which were likely used for ritual purposes. This was not a tomb of a warrior, but of a man of peace, a leader whose power was derived from his connection to the spiritual realm and his control of trade. The Ibo Jonah site, a ceremonial pit, contained a large number of finely crafted bronze objects, including vessels and ornaments, which appear to have been deliberately broken and deposited as part of a ritual. This suggests that the Iboakwa people had a complex religious system, with rituals that involved the ceremonial destruction of valuable items as an offering to their deities. It was a society that valued spiritual appeasement and tradition as much as it valued wealth. The society's art, with its delicate, intricate details and spiritual motifs, was a reflection of this worldview. Unlike the art of Benin, which was largely a form of historical documentation and propaganda, the art of Iboakwa seems to have been more personal and ritualistic. The objects were not made to be seen by the masses or to glorify a military ruler, they were made for the personal adornment of a select few and for sacred ceremonies. They tell a story of a society that was introspective, focused on its internal spiritual and commercial life rather than on external conquests. It was a civilization that thrived on trade and ritual, its power quiet and unassuming, yet incredibly wealthy and sophisticated. The artifacts, in their delicate beauty and complex symbolism, leave us with a sense of wonder and a deep-seated curiosity. They are the only voice of a people who have been silent for over 1,000 years. They hint at a rich and complex culture, a world of ritual, trade, and artistry that flourished in the heart of West Africa long before the rise of the great coastal empires. But why did this civilization fade away? What event, or series of events, led to the abandonment of their sites and the loss of their history? The lack of historical records, the absence of a written language, leaves us with a profound silence. The art, so eloquent in its beauty, is frustratingly mute on the reasons for its creator's disappearance. The silence of Iboakwa is perhaps its most profound feature. A civilization that produced such exquisite art, that traded across a continent and developed a complex, ritualistic society, seemingly vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only the rich, lonely earth of its burial mounds and ceremonial pits. The question of what led to this silence is one that continues to captivate archaeologists and historians. The leading theory is not one of a sudden, catastrophic event like a war or a famine, but of a more gradual, internal transformation. The power of the Iboaku elite, as evidenced by the elaborate burials and the sheer quantity of valuable artifacts, was tied to their role as middlemen in the long-distance trade. They controlled the flow of goods and the rituals that gave their society meaning. However, as trade routes shifted and new powers emerged in the region, perhaps even the ancestors of the later Igbo city-states and kingdoms, the Iboaku elite's monopoly on trade may have been broken. Their source of wealth dwindled, and their authority, which was based on that wealth and spiritual power, would have gradually eroded. Without the resources to maintain their elaborate rituals and their position in the trade network, their society may have fragmented, with its members dispersing and its culture slowly absorbed into the broader Igbo identity. The art of Iboaku, in this scenario, would not represent a civilization that was conquered, but one that simply faded away, its distinct identity dissolving into the wider tapestry of regional history. Another possibility is that the Iboaku society's emphasis on ritual and hierarchy, while a source of stability, also made it rigid and unable to adapt to external changes. The artifacts show a society deeply invested in its spiritual life and traditional roles. Perhaps this very conservatism prevented them from responding effectively to the new challenges of a changing world. They were masters of their craft, but they may have been unable to master the shifting currents of a new era. The artistry, which was their strength, may have also been the very thing that locked them in place while the rest of the world moved on. The Iboaku discoveries, unlike the Benin bronzes, are not a story of a kingdom's fall to external forces. They are a more quiet, introspective narrative about the delicate balance of power, trade, and culture. They remind us that history is not just about grand empires and epic battles, but also about the quiet rise and fall of societies that left no written records, their stories told only through the objects they left behind. The artifacts, with their intricate, delicate forms, are the sole survivors of this forgotten culture. They speak of a society that valued artistry, spirituality, and commerce over military might, a people who, for a time, forged a unique and prosperous path in the heart of Africa. The legacy of Iboaku is not a legacy of conquest or of a glorious past to be reclaimed. It is a legacy of mystery and a testament to the immense creativity and complexity of pre-colonial African societies. It serves as a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that complex societies in the region were a result of outside influence. The Iboaku artifacts prove that a sophisticated, artistically advanced, and wealthy civilization could flourish in the heart of the forest, entirely on its own terms. They challenge us to look beyond the well-known narratives of kings and empires and to find the quieter, more subtle stories etched in the earth and cast in bronze. The silence of Iboaku is a profound silence, one that speaks volumes about the histories we have yet to uncover. From the quiet, enigmatic tombs of Iboaku, we now move northwest to a city that is a living testament to an ancient, enduring legacy. We are in Ile-Ife, a city considered by the Yoruba people to be the mythical birthplace of humanity and the cradle of their civilization. While Benin's power was forged in bronze and its history was a chronicle of conquest, Ife's legacy is one of spirituality, art, and the intricate, almost impossibly lifelike, terracotta and bronze sculptures that would set the standard for artistry in the region. To understand Ife, you must first understand its central figure, the Uni, the spiritual head of the Yoruba people. The Uni is not just a king, he is the custodian of a divine lineage, believed to be a direct descendant of the primordial founder of the city, Oduduwa. Ife was not a military power like Benin, its influence was based on its spiritual authority. It was the Mecca of the Yoruba world, a place of pilgrimage and a source of divine sanction for new kings and kingdoms throughout the region. While Benin's art was a tool of statecraft, Ife's art was a vehicle for the divine. The artistic tradition of Ife is perhaps its most stunning feature. Sometime around the 11th century AD, the artists of Ife began producing a series of terracotta and zinc brass sculptures of a startling realism. These heads, busts, and full-figure sculptures are so lifelike that they have been compared to the finest works of classical European antiquity. The serene, naturalistic faces, with their delicate features, almond-shaped eyes, and intricately braided hairstyles, are a departure from the more stylized and symbolic art of other West African cultures. The sculptures themselves were not mass-produced, they were individual portraits, believed to represent the Uni and his court, as well as deified ancestors and mythical figures. The realism was not an accident, it was a deliberate choice. The artists, who were likely members of a respected guild, sought to capture the essence of their subjects, to create a tangible link between the living and the divine. The terracotta heads, in particular, were often found in sacred groves and on ancestral altars, suggesting that they played a central role in funerary rites and ancestor veneration. The famous Oriolican, or head of the owner of the sea, is a perfect example. This beautiful zinc brass head, believed to be a representation of the goddess of the sea, is a masterpiece of lost wax casting. The serene expression, the intricate details of the headdress, and the delicate scarification patterns on the face are a testament to the unparalleled skill of the Ife artists. The bronze work of Ife, in fact, predates that of Benin by several centuries, and it is widely believed that the Benin casters learned their craft from an Ife master. Legend has it that the Oba of Benin, seeking to improve his kingdom's artistry, requested a master caster from the Uni of Ife, who sent one of his finest artisans to Benin. This act, whether a historical fact or a cherished myth, underscores Ife's status as a spiritual and artistic wellspring. The art of Ife was a quiet power, a force that shaped the culture and beliefs of the entire Yoruba world. It was not a power of coercion, but of inspiration and divine authority. The serene faces of the sculptures and the intricate rituals they were a part of tell a story of a society that was introspective and spiritually focused. Yet, like the Iboakwa civilization, the golden age of Ife's artistry eventually came to an end. The naturalistic style of the sculptures gave way to a more stylized, less realistic form, and the production of these magnificent works ceased. The reason for this transition is not entirely clear, leaving us to wonder, what happened to the divine sculptors of the Uni, and what led to the fading of a golden age of artistry in the very heart of the Yoruba world? The artistic shift in Ife, from hyper-realistic sculptures to a more stylized form, is one of the most intriguing puzzles of its history. To understand it, we must first look at the unique nature of Ife's power, which was fundamentally different from that of its southern neighbor, Benin. While Benin's Oba held political and military sway, the Uni of Ife's authority was primarily spiritual. Ife was the ceremonial heart of the Yoruba world, a place of pilgrimage and divine consultation. Its influence was not spread through conquest, but through cultural diffusion and the sanction of its divine authority. The artisans of Ife were not just sculptors, they were priests of their craft, members of a revered guild that held the sacred knowledge of working with clay and metal. Their work was not propaganda, but a form of ancestor worship and a way to commune with the divine. The lifelike quality of the early sculptures suggests a deeply personal connection between the artist, the subject, and the spiritual world. The serene, contemplative faces on the terracotta heads are not the faces of powerful military leaders, but of individuals connected to the sacred. They speak of a society that valued inner peace and spiritual wisdom over outward displays of force. The sculptures themselves were also a medium of exchange, not in the commercial sense, but in the spiritual one. The Ife sculptures were not found in royal treasuries, but in sacred groves and on ancestral altars, places where they would have been used in rituals to honor the dead and seek their guidance. The famous Ife heads with their delicate scarification patterns, a form of personal identity and beautification, show a society that celebrated its individual members while also placing them within a broader spiritual and communal context. The city of Ife itself was a reflection of this spiritual power. It was not surrounded by massive defensive walls like Benin. Instead, its boundaries were marked by sacred groves and shrines, places where the gods were believed to dwell. The city's structure was less about military defense and more about a cosmic order. The Palace of the Uni was a central hub, a sacred space from which the spiritual power of the city emanated. This spiritual authority was a kind of soft power, one that attracted people from all over the Yoruba region to Ife for guidance, blessings, and trade. The city's wealth, therefore, was not derived from military conquest, but from its status as a pilgrimage site and a center of regional commerce. The trade was significant. The Ife artists needed copper and zinc for their bronze castings, materials that were not found locally. This suggests a vast trade network that stretched from the Yoruba hinterlands to the trans-Saharan routes. They likely traded in goods like ivory, kola nuts, and agricultural products for these metals, which were then used to create their sacred art. This commerce was a quiet, stable source of wealth, one that allowed the city to flourish for centuries without the need for military expansion. However, this reliance on spiritual authority and trade may have also been the source of the artistic shift. As new kingdoms and power centers emerged in the region, their focus was often on military strength and political dominance. The rise of places like the Oyo Empire, with its cavalry and its military conquests, may have challenged Ife's spiritual authority. The demand for the highly realistic, ritualistic art of Ife may have declined in favor of a more stylized art form that was easier to produce and better suited for a new, more militaristic age. The delicate realism of the early period, which required immense skill and time, may have become impractical in a world that was shifting from a spiritual focus to a political one. This quiet, internal shift raises a crucial question. Did the golden age of Ife's art fade because the world around it changed, or did its artistic decline reflect a deeper loss of spiritual authority and a shift in the very soul of the Yoruba people? Was the change from realistic portraiture to more symbolic forms a symptom of a cultural decline, or a deliberate adaptation to a new set of values and beliefs? The decline of Ife's golden age of naturalistic sculpture was not a sudden fall, but a gradual transition, a quiet shift in the cultural landscape of the Yoruba world. The reasons for this change are complex and multifaceted, but they ultimately point to a society that, in its spiritual and artistic focus, was unable or unwilling to adapt to the new realities of power in the region. The rise of military-focused states like Oyo meant that spiritual sanction, while still important, was no longer the sole source of political legitimacy. The final chapter of Ife's art story is not one of a dramatic end, but of a quiet transformation. The Ife artists did not disappear, their skills were simply redirected. The tradition of bronze casting, which they had perfected, was passed on to other kingdoms, most notably to Benin. While the Benin casters adopted the lost wax technique, they adapted it to their own cultural needs, creating a more stylized, symbolic, and historical art form. The Benin bronzes, with their detailed chronicles of military victories and royal power, are a direct descendant of Ife's artistry, but a far cry from its serene, naturalistic beauty. This transfer of knowledge is a powerful example of how culture and art can migrate, adapt, and evolve in new contexts. The legacy of Ife is not found in the grand walls of a lost empire, but in the spiritual heart of the Yoruba people. The city remains a sacred space, a place of pilgrimage and a source of divine authority. The Uni of Ife is still considered the spiritual head of the Yoruba, and the city continues to be a center of traditional rituals and ceremonies. The serene faces of the terracotta heads, now scattered in museums and collections around the world, are more than just art, they are a physical manifestation of a spiritual ideal that has endured for a millennium. The story of Ife teaches us a powerful lesson about the nature of power and influence. It shows us that a civilization can be profoundly influential without a massive army or a vast empire. Its power came from its spiritual authority and its artistic genius, a kind of cultural and religious soft power that shaped the identity of an entire people. The sculptures of Ife, in their tranquil realism, are a testament to a society that saw the divine in the human and the sacred in the mundane. The fading of this golden age was not a failure, but a quiet evolution. The tradition of sacred art continued, but in a different form. It moved away from individual portraits and towards more symbolic representations of power and spirituality. The art of Ife reminds us that the history of a people is not just about their triumphs and their battles, but about their beliefs, their rituals, and the quiet, enduring power of their artistic expression. The legacy of Ife is the legacy of a people who believed that the true measure of a civilization lay not in the size of its walls, but in the beauty of its soul. Our journey through Nigerian history now takes us away from the humid forests and into the open, rolling grasslands of the savannah. We move north, to a different kind of power, one built not on spiritual authority or artistic prowess, but on the strength of its cavalry and the ruthlessness of its political machine. This is the story of the Oyo Empire, a kingdom that, for nearly 2 centuries, dominated a vast swath of West Africa and whose legacy is inextricably tied to the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. The Oyo Empire was founded by the Yoruba people, a group whose cultural and spiritual heart lay in the city of Ife. Yet, while Ife's power was quiet and ceremonial, Oyo's was loud and militaristic. Its rise began in the 17th century, a period of expansion and consolidation. The secret to its success was a simple, yet profoundly effective, weapon: the horse. The tsetse fly, a carrier of a disease fatal to horses, was a major impediment to cavalry warfare in the forest regions of West Africa. But in the savannah to the north, the grasslands were free of the pest, allowing the Oyo cavalry, known as the Eso Ikoyi, to flourish. Imagine the sight: a thunderous charge of thousands of horsemen, their riders clad in protective quilted armor, their lances and bows at the ready. To the forest kingdoms of the south, who had little experience with cavalry, this was an unstoppable force. The Oyo Empire, with its swift and mobile army, was able to conquer and control a vast territory, from the Niger River to the coast. This was an empire built on conquest and tribute, its power not in the quiet authority of a spiritual leader, but in the might of its military. At the head of this empire was the Alafin, a powerful monarch who ruled from the capital city of Oyo Isle. But the Alafin's power, while immense, was not absolute. He was constrained by a powerful council of chiefs known as the Oyo Messi, and by a secret society, the Agba, which had the authority to compel a tyrannical Alafin to commit ritual suicide. This system of checks and balances, while brutal, ensured that the Alafin's power was kept in check and that the empire remained stable for generations. The wealth of the Oyo Empire was not in bronze or beads, but in tribute. The conquered kingdoms, including parts of the Dahomey and Yu territories, were forced to pay a yearly tribute of cowries, slaves, and goods. This constant flow of wealth fueled the empire's economy and allowed it to maintain its formidable army. Yet, it also created a complex web of dependencies and resentments that would, in time, become the seeds of its own destruction. The empire's success was built on a foundation of subjugation, a precarious balance that required a constant supply of new conquests and a firm hand from the Alafin. The empire's expansion brought it into contact with the European powers on the coast, particularly the Portuguese, Dutch, and British. These powers were hungry for a new commodity: slaves. The Oyo Empire, with its vast military machine and its system of tribute, became a major player in the transatlantic slave trade. The empire did not raid for slaves themselves, but rather, they used their military power to control the trade routes and to compel their tributaries to provide them with human captives. This created a symbiotic relationship. The European powers provided firearms and other goods, which the Oyo used to maintain their military superiority, and in return, the Oyo provided a constant supply of slaves for the coastal markets. This was a dark and tragic chapter in the empire's history, and it raises a troubling question. Was the rise of the Oyo Empire, with its powerful cavalry and intricate political system, ultimately a story of progress and civilization, or was it a tragic chapter of human history, a system built on the very institution that would eventually lead to its own downfall? The tragic question of the Oyo Empire's reliance on the slave trade is a complex one, and to fully grasp it, we must shift our focus to the people on the receiving end of its power, the Egba. The Egba, a subgroup of the Yoruba, were once residents of the Oyo Empire's periphery, living in a cluster of towns and villages. Their story is one of profound disruption, resilience, and the unlikely birth of a new form of government. As the Oyo Empire's power waned in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, its political structure began to fracture. The Oyo Messi and the powerful generals of the empire, the Arona Kakanfo, began to challenge the authority of the Alafin. This internal strife, coupled with a series of devastating civil wars, plunged the empire into a period of chaos. The once mighty cavalry of the savannah was now turning against itself, and the conquered territories, including the Egba, seized the opportunity to break free. But their newfound independence came at a terrible price. The collapse of the Central Oyo Authority created a power vacuum, and the Egba, without a strong central government or a unified military, were vulnerable. They were constantly raided by neighboring groups, many of them former Oyo subjects, who now saw them as a source of slaves. Faced with this existential threat, the Egba did something extraordinary. In the 1820s, a large group of Egba refugees, led by a chief named Sadiq, decided to abandon their scattered, indefensible settlements and move to a new location. They were not looking for a new kingdom, but for a new home, a place of safety and a fresh start. They found it on the rocky outcroppings of a place called Abeokuta, which means under the rock. The natural defenses of the location were ideal. The Alyamo Rock provided a natural fortress, and the surrounding terrain, with its hills and rivers, was easily defensible against cavalry attacks. It was here, in this seemingly inhospitable landscape, that the Egba built a new city. But this was no ordinary city. It was a city of refugees, a collection of disparate groups from different towns who had come together for survival. They did not have a single king, but a council of chiefs from the various clans, who governed through a system of consensus. This was the birth of the Egba United Government, a unique political experiment in the region. It was not a monarchy, but a proto-republic, a government based on a federation of communities. The chiefs, known as the Agboni, were responsible for the daily administration, while the Oloragun chiefs were in charge of military affairs. This system, born out of necessity, proved to be incredibly effective. It allowed them to unite their forces against external threats, to manage the complex social dynamics of a city of refugees, and to create a new, shared identity. Abeokuta became a sanctuary, a magnet for other displaced people from the collapsing Oyo Empire. It was a city built on resilience and an unshakable determination to survive. The Egba, once victims of the Oyo military machine, were now a formidable force in their own right. They repelled multiple attacks from Dahomey, a powerful kingdom that was also deeply involved in the slave trade. The city's location and its unified defense proved to be its greatest strength. The Egba's story is one of a people who, in the face of immense adversity, abandoned the traditional model of a monarchy and created a new form of governance. It was a quiet revolution born out of chaos, a testament to the human capacity for adaptation and resilience. But their story also leads to a more complex, and perhaps more troubling, question. While the Egba United Government was a sanctuary from the chaos of the collapsing Oyo Empire, what role did it play in the wider regional conflicts and the continued violence of the slave trade that raged around them? And how did this unique republic, built on the foundations of a shared trauma, manage to maintain its fragile unity in a world of warring empires and European encroachment? The Egba United Government, a republic born of chaos and necessity, faced an ongoing struggle for survival. Its unique form of decentralized governance and its strategic location at Abeokuta proved to be its greatest assets, allowing it to withstand repeated attacks from the powerful Dahomey Kingdom. But this resilience was also a double-edged sword. The city's status as a sanctuary for refugees and its growing economic power made it a magnet for conflict, and its internal politics, a delicate balance of competing clans, was always on the verge of fragmentation. The Egba's location also placed them at a crucial nexus of commerce and conflict. The city, which sat on a major trade route, became a hub for a variety of goods, including palm oil, cotton, and ivory. However, it was the slave trade that remained a persistent and insidious presence. While the Egba United Government was a refuge from the violence of the collapsing Oyo Empire, it was not entirely immune to the regional dynamics of the slave trade. The city's military campaigns against its rivals often resulted in the capture of prisoners, some of whom were then sold into slavery. This complex and uncomfortable reality highlights the moral ambiguities of a period in which survival often came at a terrible price. The Egba's story took another turn with the arrival of Christian missionaries in the mid-19th century. The missionaries, a combination of European and freed Sierra Leonean slaves of Yoruba descent, saw Abeokuta as a promising place to establish a mission. They were impressed by the Egba's political stability and their openness to new ideas. The missionaries brought with them not just a new religion, but also Western education and commerce, which fundamentally reshaped the city's future. The Egba, in turn, saw the British as potential allies against their rivals, particularly the Dahomey. This led to a period of cooperation, with the Egba opening their city to British influence and, in a significant move, outlawing the slave trade within their own territories. However, this alliance with the British proved to be as complicated as it was beneficial. The British, with their growing colonial ambitions, were not just interested in spreading Christianity, they were interested in control. The Egba United Government, with its unique blend of traditional chiefs and Western-educated elites, was a thorn in the side of British colonial administrators who sought to impose a more centralized form of rule. The British saw the Egba as a powerful, but unpredictable, entity that had to be brought to heel. The final act of this political drama came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The British, through a series of treaties and military threats, gradually eroded the Egba's independence. In 1914, the British colonial administration formally incorporated Abeokuta into the Protectorate of Nigeria, ending the experiment of the Egba United Government. The unique political system that had allowed a people to survive a period of immense turmoil was dismantled in favor of a centralized colonial administration. The story of the Egba United Government is a powerful reflection on the nature of history and resilience. It shows us that in the face of immense trauma, people can create new and innovative ways to govern themselves. The Egba's Republic, born of refugee camps and a shared desire for survival, was a testament to the human spirit. Yet, it also serves as a poignant reminder that even the most innovative and successful forms of self-governance can be undone by the larger, more powerful forces of empire. The Egba United Government, a quiet and remarkable experiment, did not fail from within. It was simply overtaken by a history that was far larger than itself. Its legacy, however, lives on in the city of Abeokuta, a place that continues to embody the spirit of resilience and the unyielding desire for self-determination. We now turn our attention eastward, to the dense forests and winding rivers of what is now southeastern Nigeria. Here, the power dynamics were entirely different from the kingdoms of Oyo and Benin. There were no grand walled cities, no standing armies of horsemen, and no singular, divine monarch. Instead, power was held by a loose confederacy of clans, and its authority was based not on military might, but on the spiritual power of a single oracle. This was the Aro Confederacy, and its story is a fascinating, and often disturbing, tale of how a religious institution became the center of a vast commercial empire. The Aro Confederacy was centered around the town of Arachukwu, which means the Spear of God. At the heart of this town was a sacred shrine known as the Abini Ukpabi, or the Long Juju, a powerful oracle believed to be the voice of the supreme deity of the Igbo people. The Aro, a clan of Igbo people, were the custodians of this oracle. Their power stemmed from their ability to interpret the will of the gods and to act as a final arbiter in disputes. When a conflict arose between two Igbo clans, or when an individual was accused of a crime, they would travel to Arachukwu to consult the oracle. The oracle, speaking through a series of priests and hidden voices, would deliver a verdict, which was considered final and binding. The Long Juju was a fearsome institution. The path to the oracle was a labyrinth of caves and dark tunnels, designed to intimidate and disorient. When a person entered the shrine, they were met with a series of spiritual trials and an elaborate system of sound effects and illusions. The oracle's judgments were often harsh, and those found guilty were believed to have been swallowed by the deity. In reality, they were sold into slavery by the Aro, their disappearance providing a powerful deterrent to anyone who might challenge the oracle's authority. This spiritual authority was the foundation of a vast commercial network. The Aro, in their role as spiritual arbiters, traveled throughout the Igbo heartland and beyond, spreading the influence of the oracle and establishing a network of trade settlements. These settlements, known as Aro colonies, were strategically located on major trade routes and at the headwaters of navigable rivers. They were staffed by Aro agents, who not only facilitated trade but also acted as representatives of the oracle, collecting tribute and settling disputes in the name of the Abini Ukpabi. The Aro Confederacy's power was not centralized in the traditional sense. It was a network, a spiderweb of spiritual and commercial influence that stretched from the coast to the interior. The Aro did not have a central government or a single king. Instead, they relied on a system of consensus and a shared sense of identity as custodians of the oracle. The oracle provided the spiritual legitimacy, and the Arrow agents provided the commercial muscle. They were masters of a quiet, insidious form of power, one that relied on faith, fear, and a vast network of information and commerce. This raises a fascinating, and deeply disturbing, question. Was the Arrow Confederacy a religious institution that simply adapted to a commercial reality, or was it a cynical, profit-driven enterprise that used religion as a cover for its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade? The Arrow Confederacy was a masterful example of a society that leveraged spiritual authority for commercial gain. The Abini Ukbabi Oracle was not just a religious institution, it was a central node in a vast, interconnected network of fear and commerce. The Arrow, as its custodians, were the ultimate middlemen, controlling the flow of goods and people across a wide territory. Their power was not visible in grand palaces or massive armies, but in the quiet, pervasive influence of their agents and the chilling reputation of their oracle. The oracle's verdicts were a form of social control and a source of immense wealth. When a person was swallowed by the oracle, their disappearance was often a carefully orchestrated illusion. They were not killed, but rather sold into slavery and transported through a series of secret routes to the coast. The Arrow's agents, strategically placed in their trade settlements or Arrow colonies, facilitated this process. They acted as intelligence gatherers, brokers, and enforcers, ensuring that the human cargo reached the European slave traders on the coast. The Arrow's role in the transatlantic slave trade was not one of simple participation, but of management and control. They were the primary suppliers in the region, their religious authority providing a steady stream of captives that other groups were unable to match. The Arrow's commercial empire was not limited to human trafficking. They also traded in a variety of other goods, including ivory, palm oil, and locally produced textiles. The network they established was incredibly efficient, allowing for the rapid movement of goods and information across a vast and often fragmented region. Their power lay in their ability to bridge the gap between the isolated communities of the interior and the European trading posts on the coast. They acted as a kind of pre-industrial logistics company, their spiritual authority providing the trust and security that was necessary for such a large-scale commercial operation. The Arrow's success was also a result of their diplomatic skill. They rarely engaged in direct military conquest. Instead, they relied on alliances, threats, and a reputation for spiritual power to maintain their control. They would often incite conflicts between rival clans, only to then offer their services as arbiters, which would lead to more consultations with the oracle and, consequently, more captives for the slave trade. It was a sophisticated and ruthless system that used religion as a tool of exploitation. The Arrow Confederacy's story is a chilling reminder of how a spiritual institution, designed to provide justice and guidance, could be corrupted by the pursuit of wealth and power. It also raises a profound question about the nature of a society built on such a foundation. How did the Arrow people, who were themselves a clan within the broader Igbo society, reconcile their role as spiritual leaders with their active participation in the enslavement of their own people? And what would happen when this network of fear and commerce came into contact with a larger, more powerful force that saw their influence as a direct challenge to its own authority? The Arrow Confederacy, with its intricate network of spiritual and commercial control, seemed impregnable. Its power, based on fear, faith, and profit, extended far beyond its physical boundaries. But like all systems built on a precarious foundation, it was eventually destined to collapse. The final chapter of the Arrow Confederacy's story is a stark example of a religious and commercial empire being dismantled by a force it could not comprehend or control: British colonialism. By the late 19th century, the British Empire's influence in the region was growing. The British saw the Arrow Confederacy as a major impediment to their colonial ambitions. The Arrow's control of the trade routes and their continued involvement in the slave trade were a direct challenge to the British desire to establish a centralized administration and to replace the slave trade with what they called legitimate commerce, primarily palm oil and other agricultural products. The British saw the Abini Ukbabi Oracle not as a legitimate religious institution, but as a fraudulent and diabolical scheme that had to be destroyed. In 1901, the British launched the Arrow Expedition, a military campaign aimed at dismantling the Arrow Confederacy and destroying the Oracle. The British forces, with their superior firepower and organization, marched on Arachukwu. The Arrow, who had no standing army and relied on a network of alliances and intimidation, were ill-prepared for a direct military confrontation. The expedition was a swift and decisive victory for the British. The sacred shrine of the Abini Ukbabi was destroyed, its priests were arrested, and the network of Arrow agents and trade colonies was systematically dismantled. The fall of the Arrow Confederacy was a profound and traumatic event for the region. It marked the end of an era, a period in which spiritual authority and commercial power were inextricably linked. The destruction of the Oracle, which had for centuries been the final arbiter of justice and the source of immense wealth, left a power vacuum that the British were quick to fill. It ushered in a new era of colonial rule, in which power was no longer held by local institutions, but by a foreign administration. The legacy of the Arrow Confederacy is a complex and uncomfortable one. On one hand, its destruction brought an end to a system that had actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade. On the other hand, it also meant the loss of a unique form of indigenous governance and the imposition of a colonial system that would bring its own set of injustices. The story of the Arrow Confederacy is not just a story of a lost empire, it is a story of how a system of power, no matter how intricate and successful, can be undone by a larger historical force. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the end of one form of exploitation can sometimes be the beginning of another. The silent remains of the Arrow's trade routes and the memory of the Long Juju are a quiet reminder of a period in which religion, commerce, and power were woven together in a complex and tragic tapestry. We now venture into a different kind of power, one that existed not through military might, trade monopolies, or even a formidable cavalry. Our destination is the Kingdom of Nri, a society nestled in the heart of what is now southeastern Nigeria. Nri was a quiet, almost unassuming, kingdom, yet its influence was vast and its legacy profound. Its power was derived from an entirely different source, spiritual authority and a reputation for peace and ritual purity. The Kingdom of Nri was founded by the legendary Eri, a divine figure believed to have descended from the sky. The Nri, the king of Nri, was not a political or military leader, but a sacred ruler, a priest-king whose authority was based on his spiritual purity. He was the guardian of the kingdom's traditions, a direct link between the people and the divine. The Nri did not command armies or collect tribute through force. His influence was exercised through a network of traveling ritual specialists known as Nri men, who spread the kingdom's spiritual authority throughout the Igbo heartland. The Nri men were revered figures, their role a testament to the power of ritual and the sanctity of peace. They traveled to other Igbo communities, performing ceremonies of purification, cleansing, and resolving disputes. They were the arbiters of tradition, the spiritual guides who brought order and stability to a region that was often fragmented and prone to internal conflict. Their presence was a sign of peace, and their authority was respected by all. They could lift taboos, install new leaders, and even sanction the building of new homes, all in the name of the Nri. The kingdom's economy was also built on a foundation of peace and ritual. The Nri had the power to lift the Nso-Ani, taboo of the land, which allowed for the cultivation of new crops and the creation of new settlements. The kingdom also held a monopoly on certain ritual items, such as the sacred aji, kola nut, and a special type of salt, which they traded for other goods. This trade was not conducted through force or coercion, but through the respect and spiritual authority that the Nri men commanded. The Kingdom of Nri was an anomaly in the history of pre-colonial West Africa. It was a kingdom that rejected warfare and embraced a philosophy of nonviolence. Its influence was a soft power, one that was built on respect, spiritual sanction, and a deep-seated belief in the power of ritual. Its success, however, was also its greatest vulnerability. In a world of rising military powers and European encroachment, how could a kingdom built on peace and spiritual authority survive? Was its gentle, ritualistic nature an enduring strength, or was it a fatal flaw in a world that was becoming increasingly defined by conquest and commerce? The Kingdom of Nri's peaceful existence was not a result of naivete, but a deliberate and highly organized system of governance that eschewed violence in favor of ritual. The E's NRI, the priest king, was the central figure of this system, his authority so revered that he was seen as a living link to the sky. His palace was not a fortress, but a sacred space where the laws of the land, based on a code of moral and ritual purity, were maintained. The most significant of these laws were the taboos, or nso, which governed everything from social interactions to agriculture. The NRI men were the enforcers of this code, their presence in a community a reminder of the spiritual power of NRI. The kingdom's wealth, and the source of its influence, came from its control over the production and distribution of two key commodities, ritual items and a special kind of salt. The NRI men were the sole producers of the ceremonial chalk, or nzu, which was used in a variety of rituals throughout the Igbo heartland. This monopoly gave them immense spiritual and commercial power. However, their most significant source of wealth was a special type of salt. The salt, which was produced in a few select communities under NRI's spiritual guidance, was not just a seasoning, it was a ritual item, a symbol of purity and a medium of exchange. The salt barons of NRI, as they were known, controlled this lucrative trade, their wealth secured not by force of arms, but by the sanctity of their spiritual authority. The system was a marvel of social and economic engineering. The E's NRI would periodically send out NRI men on long journeys, which could last for years. These journeys were not conquests, but pilgrimages. The NRI men would travel from village to village, settling disputes, performing cleansing rituals, and installing new leaders. In return for their services, they would receive gifts and tribute, which would be used to support the kingdom and its rituals. The NRI men were not just priests, they were diplomats and merchants, their spiritual authority providing a kind of passport that allowed them to travel safely through a politically fragmented region. The power of NRI was in its moral authority. The E's NRI had the power to excommunicate a community, to declare it unclean and beyond the pale of spiritual society. This was a fearsome punishment, one that could lead to social and economic ruin. This moral power was far more effective than any army. It was a form of non-violent control that was both subtle and absolute. The kingdom's influence was not a result of military conquest, but of a quiet, unyielding belief in the power of ritual and the importance of peace. However, the kingdom's reliance on spiritual authority and non-violence also made it vulnerable. As the world around it changed, as new military powers like the Arrow Confederacy and the British Empire emerged, the gentle authority of NRI began to lose its relevance. Its power, which was based on a shared set of beliefs and a stable social order, was ill-equipped to handle a world of changing economies and encroaching empires. This leads us to a final, and deeply poignant, question: could a kingdom built on peace and ritual purity survive in a world that was becoming increasingly defined by war, conquest, and the brutal realities of the slave trade? The kingdom of NRI's peaceful existence was a testament to the power of spiritual authority, but it was also an anomaly in a world that was increasingly defined by violence and colonialism. The end of the NRI kingdom's influence was not a sudden, dramatic event like the fall of Benin or the destruction of the Arrow Oracle. It was a slow, gradual process, a quiet fading of an old order in the face of a new one. As the transatlantic slave trade intensified, the gentle authority of the E's NRI was no longer enough to maintain order. The promise of wealth from human trafficking, and the new firearms that came with it, made many communities turn away from the peaceful guidance of the NRI men and towards the brutal realities of war. The Arrow Confederacy, with its powerful oracle and its vast commercial network, was a direct challenge to NRI's authority. The Arrow were able to provide a service, the resolution of disputes and the acquisition of wealth, that was faster, and often more profitable, than the slow, ritualistic process of the NRI kingdom. The arrival of the British in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the final blow. The British, with their centralized administration and their desire to control all aspects of life, had no use for a decentralized kingdom based on spiritual authority. They saw the NRI men not as revered priests, but as a potential source of resistance to their rule. The British colonial administration systematically dismantled the NRI kingdom's network, undermining the authority of the E's NRI and replacing his spiritual laws with their own. In 1911, the British colonial authorities, under the pretense of civilizing the region, formally ended the ritual journeys of the NRI men. The sacred rites that had for centuries been the source of NRI's power were declared illegal. The kingdom, which had survived for over 1,000 years on the strength of its spiritual authority, was now nothing more than a historical curiosity. The NRI, once a revered priest-king, was now just a traditional ruler with no real power. The story of the kingdom of NRI is a quiet tragedy. It is the story of a civilization that, in its gentle, non-violent nature, was unable to survive a world that was becoming increasingly violent and commercial. Its legacy, however, is not one of failure, but of a profound and enduring ideal. The kingdom of NRI left behind no great walls, no massive armies, and no vast empire. Its legacy is found in the enduring values of the Igbo people, a deep-seated respect for peace, a love of negotiation and consensus, and a belief in the power of moral and spiritual authority. The story of the Salt Barons of NRI is a quiet reminder that true power does not always reside in the might of an army, but in the strength of an idea. Our final stop on this historical journey takes us to the intricate, watery world of the Niger Delta. Here, in a labyrinth of mangrove swamps and winding rivers, a different kind of kingdom emerged, one based not on land, but on water. This was the Kingdom of Bani, a powerful city-state that, for centuries, dominated the trade routes of the Delta and became a major player in both the slave trade and the subsequent legitimate commerce of palm oil. Bani was a maritime empire, a Venice of Africa, whose power was held by a unique social and political institution, the canoe house. Imagine a city built on the water, its houses on stilts, its streets replaced by a network of canals. This was Bani, and its very existence was a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of its people. The people of Bani, a group of fishermen and traders, realized early on that their power lay not in the land they inhabited, but in the rivers that connected them to the interior. They became master sailors and traders, their large, seafaring canoes a familiar sight in the Delta. The canoe houses, or wherry in the local language, were the backbone of Bani's society. They were not just a family unit, but a political, social, and commercial organization. Each canoe house was led by a powerful chief, a man who had risen through the ranks through a combination of business acumen and military prowess. The chief's authority was not inherited, but earned, a testament to Bani's meritocratic system. The canoe houses were responsible for everything: trade, defense, and the social welfare of their members. They were a kind of pre-industrial corporation, with their own fleets of canoes, their own warehouses, and their own armed guards. The kingdom of Bani's power was built on a series of monopolies. They controlled the flow of goods from the interior to the European trading ships on the coast. They acted as middlemen, trading European goods like firearms, rum, and textiles for slaves, ivory, and palm oil from the interior. The canoe houses were in constant competition with each other, each vying for a larger share of the lucrative trade. This competition, while fierce, was also a source of innovation and efficiency, as each canoe house sought to outmaneuver its rivals. Bani's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was significant. The canoe houses were the primary suppliers of human captives to the European slave ships. The wealth generated from this trade transformed Bani into a powerful and prosperous city-state. But its reliance on the slave trade also made it vulnerable. As the British Empire began to take steps to abolish the slave trade in the 19th century, the Kingdom of Bani faced an existential crisis. Its economy, which had been built on human trafficking, was suddenly under threat. This leads to a crucial question: how would a kingdom, whose very existence was tied to the institution of slavery, adapt to a new world order that sought to abolish it? And would the canoe houses, once the source of Bani's power, be able to navigate the turbulent waters of a changing global economy? The question of how Bani would survive the end of the slave trade was a matter of life or death for the kingdom. Its entire political and social structure, centered around the canoe houses, was built on the foundation of human trafficking. When the British, driven by a combination of moral fervor and economic interest, began to aggressively suppress the slave trade in the early 19th century, Bani was forced to adapt or face ruin. The shift was not a smooth one. The canoe house chiefs, who had become immensely wealthy from the slave trade, initially resisted the change. They saw the British abolition efforts as an attack on their way of life and a threat to their sovereignty. However, the British Navy, with its powerful warships, made continued involvement in the slave trade increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. The Bonny chiefs, ever the pragmatists, realized that they had to find a new source of income. That new source came in the form of palm oil. The Niger Delta, with its vast mangrove swamps and its ideal climate, was a prime location for the cultivation and processing of palm oil. The canoe houses, with their existing trade networks and their large, seafaring canoes, were perfectly positioned to dominate this new trade. They simply shifted their focus from human beings to a different kind of commodity, a kind of pre-industrial lubricant for the machinery of the burgeoning European Industrial Revolution. This shift to palm oil, which the British called legitimate commerce, was a period of intense change and internal strife for the Kingdom of Bonny. The canoe houses that adapted quickly to the new trade prospered, while those that clung to the old ways faded into obscurity. The competition between the houses, which had once been about who could deliver the most slaves, was now about who could secure the most palm oil. This led to a series of internal conflicts and rivalries, most famously the one between the houses of Chief Pepple and Chief Jaja. Chief Jaja, a former slave who had risen to become a powerful chief, was one of the most successful figures of this new era. He was a shrewd businessman and a formidable politician who saw that the future lay in controlling the source of the palm oil, not just its transport. He moved his house and his people upriver, establishing a new kingdom at Apobo and seeking to bypass the Bonny chiefs altogether. This was a direct challenge to Bonny's authority, and it led to a period of intense economic and political warfare between the two city-states. The story of Bonny's transition from the slave trade to palm oil is a powerful example of human resilience and adaptability. It shows how a society, faced with an existential crisis, can fundamentally transform its economic and social structure. But it also raises a new, and deeply complex, question. While the Kingdom of Bonny successfully navigated the end of the slave trade, did its reliance on a new form of commerce, one that was still controlled by European powers, simply lead to a new kind of dependence, a slow and quiet form of colonial encroachment? And would the canoe houses, once the source of Bonny's power, be able to withstand the final, crushing blow of a history that was no longer in their control? The final act of Bonny's history is a story of a kingdom that, having successfully navigated a monumental shift in its economy, was ultimately undone by the relentless march of colonial expansion. The rivalry between the Pepple and Jaja factions, which had been a source of both innovation and conflict, became a perfect opening for the British to assert their dominance. Chief Jaja, who had moved upriver to found the Kingdom of Apobo, was a constant thorn in the side of the British. He was a master of the palm oil trade, and he sought to maintain his independence by cutting out the British middlemen and trading directly with European merchants. He was a true entrepreneur, a man who had risen from slavery to become a powerful king, and his defiance of the British was a direct challenge to their growing power in the region. The British, in turn, were not just interested in commerce, they were interested in political control. They saw Jaja's independence as a threat to their plans for a centralized administration in the Niger Delta. In 1887, the British consul, Henry Hamilton Johnston, invited Jaja aboard a British warship under the pretense of negotiation. Once on board, however, Jaja was arrested and exiled to the West Indies. His capture was a clear and brutal message to all the chiefs of the Delta: the era of independent city-states was over. With Jaja out of the picture, the British were able to impose their will on the Delta. They signed treaties with the remaining chiefs of Bonny, forcing them to accept British protection and to give up their control over the trade. The canoe houses, once powerful corporations, were now relegated to being simple transport units for the British trading companies. The unique political and social system that had defined Bonny for centuries was slowly but surely dismantled. By the early 20th century, the Kingdom of Bonny, once a powerful maritime empire, was fully incorporated into the British Protectorate of Nigeria. Its rulers, once feared and respected chiefs, were now little more than ceremonial figures. The story of Bonny, from a small fishing settlement to a powerful slave trading state and then to a major player in the palm oil trade, is a microcosm of the larger historical forces at play in West Africa. It is a story of a kingdom that, in its relentless pursuit of survival, adapted to a changing world, only to be swallowed whole by the final, and most powerful, force of all, colonialism. The silent remains of its waterfront and the memory of its powerful canoe houses are a quiet, poignant reminder of a time when the rivers of the Delta were the highways of a proud and powerful empire. Our journey now takes us far to the north, to the arid, sun-scorched lands of the Sahel, a place of dusty plains and ancient caravan routes. This is a story not of a city-state or a maritime empire, but of a vast, theocratic empire forged in the crucible of religious fervor and intellectual revival. This is the story of the Sokoto Caliphate, a powerful state that would, in the 19th century, become one of the largest and most influential empires in West Africa. The story begins not with a king, but with a scholar. Usman Dan Fodio was a revered Islamic scholar and teacher of the Fulani ethnic group. He lived in the city-state of Gobir, a Hausa kingdom that was part of a fragmented political landscape. He was a man of immense learning and piety, who was deeply troubled by what he saw as the moral decay and corrupt practices of the Hausa ruling class. He believed that the rulers were not adhering to the true principles of Islam, that they were extorting the poor, and that they were mixing Islamic practices with pagan rituals. Usman Dan Fodio began to preach against these injustices, calling for a return to a purer form of Islam. He gathered a following of students and disciples, known as the Jihadiyya, who were inspired by his message of reform and social justice. His movement, which was initially intellectual and spiritual, began to take on a political dimension. The Hausa rulers, who saw Dan Fodio as a threat to their power, began to persecute his followers. In 1804, faced with persecution and the threat of assassination, Usman Dan Fodio and his followers fled Gobir. This act, known as the Hijra, or migration, marked the beginning of a holy war, or jihad, against the Hausa city-states. The jihad was a swift and decisive success. Usman Dan Fodio was a charismatic and brilliant military leader, and his followers were motivated by a shared sense of religious purpose. They were not just a military force, they were a social movement. They promised a new order based on justice, equality, and a purer form of Islam. The Hausa rulers, with their fragmented and often tyrannical rule, were unable to mount a coordinated defense. One by one, the Hausa city-states fell to the forces of the jihad. The result was the creation of a vast new empire, the Sokoto Caliphate. The Caliphate, with its capital at Sokoto, was not just a military state, it was a theocracy, a state governed by Islamic law. It was an intellectual powerhouse, a center of learning and scholarship that attracted scholars from all over the Muslim world. But the Caliphate was also a military machine, a state that had to be constantly vigilant against internal dissent and external threats. It was an empire forged in a jihad, and it raises a fascinating, and deeply complex, question: could a state founded on religious revival and intellectual purity maintain its ideals in the face of the political and economic realities of ruling a vast, diverse empire? The Sokoto Caliphate was an intellectual powerhouse, a beacon of Islamic learning and reform in the 19th century Sahel. Its founder, Usman Dan Fodio, and his brother Abdullahi Dan Fodio, and his son Muhammad Bello, were prolific writers and scholars. They wrote thousands of books and treatises on a wide range of subjects, from Islamic law and theology to poetry and history. Their work was not just for a select few, it was meant to be read by all, and they sought to establish a society based on a clear, accessible understanding of Islamic principles. The Caliphate's administration was a marvel of organization. It was a decentralized system, with the Sokoto Caliph at its head, and a series of semi-autonomous emirates, each led by an emir. The emirs, who were often the military leaders of the jihad, were responsible for the daily administration of their territories. They were expected to govern according to the principles of Islamic law, to collect taxes, and to maintain a standing army. The system, while complex, was designed to ensure that the Caliphate remained a unified and cohesive entity. The Caliphate's economy was built on a combination of agriculture, trade, and tribute. The fertile lands of the northern savanna were ideal for growing crops like millet, sorghum, and cotton. The Caliphate was also a major hub of the trans-Saharan trade, with its cities and towns serving as a major crossroads for caravans traveling from North Africa to the south. However, the Caliphate's economy, like that of many other states in the region, was also deeply entangled in the slave trade. The jihad had produced a large number of captives, who were used as laborers on agricultural estates and as soldiers in the Caliphate's army. While the Dan Fodio brothers had initially called for a moral and social reform, the reality of running a vast empire led to a compromise with the economic and political realities of the time. The Caliphate's existence was a constant struggle to reconcile its religious ideals with the practicalities of governance. Its leaders sought to create a just and equitable society, but they were also a ruling class that relied on the tribute and labor of their subjects. The initial fervor of the jihad began to wane, and the Caliphate, like all empires, faced internal conflicts and the inevitable tensions between its rulers and its subjects. The story of the Sokoto Caliphate is a poignant reminder that even the most idealistic of movements can be corrupted by the realities of power. It raises a crucial question: would a caliphate, forged in a jihad of intellectual and spiritual purity, be able to withstand the relentless march of a new, and far more powerful, force that was about to arrive on its doorstep, European colonialism? The Sokoto Caliphate, with its vast territory and its formidable military, seemed destined to endure. It had survived internal rebellions and external threats, and its intellectual and spiritual influence was felt throughout the region. However, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it faced a new and unprecedented threat: the British Empire. The British, with their superior military technology and their insatiable appetite for land and resources, saw the Caliphate not as a spiritual institution, but as a political entity that had to be brought under their control. The British military campaign against the Sokoto Caliphate began in 1900. The British forces, led by the formidable and ruthless Frederick Lugard, were a well-equipped and well-disciplined fighting force. The Caliphate's army, with its cavalry and its reliance on traditional weapons, was no match for the British rifles and artillery. The British were able to conquer the Caliphate's major cities, including Sokoto, with relative ease. The Caliph, Muhammad Adhairu II, was killed in battle in 1903, and the Caliphate was formally incorporated into the British Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. The fall of the Sokoto Caliphate was not just a military defeat, it was the end of a unique political and social experiment. The theocratic state, which had been founded on the ideals of justice and religious purity, was now a mere province in a much larger, and far less moral, empire. The British dismantled the Caliphate's political structure, replacing its Islamic-based legal system with their own. However, in a shrewd and pragmatic move, the British did not completely abolish the Caliphate. Instead, they adopted a system of indirect rule, in which they governed the territory through the existing traditional rulers, including the emirs of the Caliphate. This allowed them to maintain a semblance of order while still asserting their ultimate control. The legacy of the Sokoto Caliphate is a complex and enduring one. On one hand, it was an empire built on a foundation of intellectual and spiritual revival. On the other, it was a state that relied on the institution of slavery and was ultimately undone by the same forces that were reshaping the world. Its legacy lives on in the religious and intellectual traditions of the region, and in the enduring influence of its founders. The Sokoto Caliphate, though a lost empire, is a powerful reminder that even the most well-intentioned of movements can be undone by the relentless march of history, and that the line between a holy war and a political conquest can often be blurred. Our historical journey now leads us to a kingdom shrouded in myth and mystery, a place whose very name, Kwarafa, once struck fear into the hearts of its neighbors. Located in the Benue River basin of what is now central Nigeria, the Kwarafa kingdom was not a vast, sprawling empire like Sokoto or a maritime power like Bani. Instead, it was a confederacy of peoples, led by the Jukuan, a group renowned for their military prowess and their ability to strike deep into the heart of neighboring territories. The story of Kwarafa is one of a quiet, unassuming people who, for a time, wielded immense and terrifying power. The origin of the Kwarafa kingdom is a matter of legend. The Jukuan people, its founders, are believed to have migrated from the northeast, their history intertwined with ancient caravan routes and the great civilizations of the Sahel. They were not known for their artistry or their scholarly pursuits. Their reputation was built on a single, formidable skill: warfare. The Jukuan were master archers and horsemen, and their military campaigns were legendary. For centuries, they raided the Hausa city-states to the north, demanding tribute and sowing chaos. The Hausa chroniclers, in their fear, wrote of the Quararafa as a fearsome, almost mythical enemy, a people who could appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The power of the Quararafa was not centralized in a single, divine monarch like the Oba of Benin. It was a more fluid, decentralized form of power, held by a series of warrior chiefs who commanded small, highly mobile armies. The kingdom's political structure was a confederacy, a loose alliance of different Jukuan clans and other ethnic groups who were bound together by a shared sense of military purpose and a common enemy. This decentralized structure was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed them to mount swift, devastating raids, but it also made them vulnerable to internal conflicts and the inevitable tensions between competing chiefs. The kingdom's economy was built on plunder and tribute. The Jukuan did not have a monopoly on a particular commodity like the arrow or the bani. Instead, they used their military power to extract wealth from their neighbors. The Hausa city-states, in particular, were a rich source of tribute, which allowed the Jukuan to maintain their formidable military. The kingdom's influence was not a result of its control over trade routes or its spiritual authority, it was a result of its ability to project military power. The Quararafa kingdom's story is a quiet, yet powerful, reminder that history is not always written by the most powerful or the most civilized. It can also be shaped by a people who, for a time, possessed a unique and devastating skill. But this raises a crucial question: what happens to a kingdom whose power is based on military prowess when the world around it changes, when new, more powerful forces emerge, and when the very art of war is transformed by technology and the relentless march of history? Was the Quararafa kingdom's reliance on force its greatest strength or its fatal flaw? The reliance of the Quararafa kingdom on military power was both the source of its immense influence and the cause of its eventual decline. As the 18th century drew to a close, the world around the Jukuan was changing. The Hausa city-states, under the influence of the Fulani Jihad, were becoming more unified and militarily formidable. The rise of the Sokoto Caliphate, with its vast, well-organized army, was a direct challenge to the Quararafa's dominance. The Caliphate, with its new, unified purpose and its vast resources, was a force that the decentralized Jukuan Confederacy was ill-equipped to handle. The decline was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, gradual erosion of power. The Jukuan's military advantage, which had once been so decisive, began to wane. The Hausa, now fighting under a single banner, were able to mount a coordinated defense, and the frequent raids that had sustained the Quararafa economy became less profitable and more dangerous. The kingdom, which had been a formidable military power for centuries, was now on the defensive. The internal divisions of the Confederacy also began to take their toll. Without a common enemy to unite them, the various Jukuan clans and their allies began to turn on each other. The decentralized political structure, which had once been a source of strength, now became a source of instability. The kingdom's unity, which had been forged in the crucible of war, began to fracture in the face of peace and internal strife. The final blow to the Quararafa kingdom was the arrival of European colonialism. The British, with their superior military technology and their desire to control the trade routes of the Benue River Basin, saw the fragmented remnants of the kingdom as an easy target. The once feared warriors of the East were now fighting with bows and arrows against rifles and machine guns. The British were able to conquer the Jukuan and their allies with relative ease, and the kingdom was formally incorporated into the British Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. The legacy of the Quararafa kingdom is not found in grand monuments or a vast written history. It is found in the enduring legends of its military prowess and in the quiet resilience of the Jukuan people. The Jukuan, who were once a feared and powerful force, were now a minority group in a much larger, and far less sympathetic, empire. The story of the Kwarafa kingdom is a poignant reminder that even the most powerful of empires, if their power is based on a single, outdated skill, are destined to fade. It is a story of how a people, who for centuries had shaped history with their military might, were ultimately swallowed by a history that was no longer their own. But their story also leaves us with a final, and deeply reflective, thought. In a world of constant change, is a single-minded focus on military power a path to glory or a path to ruin? The Kwarafa kingdom, once a formidable force, may have faded into history, but the Jukuan people, and the legacy of their warrior past, have endured. The kingdom's story is not a simple tale of a glorious rise and a tragic fall. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and the enduring power of a people's identity. The Jukuan, once the undisputed masters of the Benue River Basin, were forced to adapt to a new reality under British colonial rule. They were no longer a dominant political or military force. They became a people who had to navigate a new system of governance, one that was alien to their traditions and their history. They were forced to abandon their reliance on warfare and to find new ways to survive in a world that was no longer defined by their military prowess. The legacy of the Kwarafa kingdom, however, lives on in the oral traditions and the cultural practices of the Jukuan people. The stories of their great warriors and their legendary raids are still told, a reminder of a time when they were a force to be reckoned with. Their political and social structures, while dismantled by the British, left an indelible mark on their culture. The Jukuan people, with their history of a decentralized confederacy, are a testament to the idea that a society does not need a single, all-powerful king to be strong. The story of the Kwarafa kingdom is a powerful counter-narrative to the more traditional histories of centralized empires. It shows us that history is not just about the grand rise and fall of kingdoms, but about the quiet, enduring resilience of a people. It reminds us that a civilization can be profoundly influential, not because of its size or its wealth, but because of its unique and powerful skills. The Kwarafa kingdom, though a lost empire, is a powerful reminder that the true measure of a people is not found in the monuments they build or the empires they conquer, but in the stories they tell and the legacy they leave behind. Our journey now takes us to the fertile floodplains of the Niger River, to a kingdom that was a master of two seemingly contradictory arts: intricate brass work and relentless warfare. This is the story of the Nub Kingdom, a powerful state that, for centuries, dominated a vast territory and whose legacy is inextricably linked to its skilled artisans and its formidable military. The Nub people, the founders of the kingdom, were renowned for their expertise in metalwork. They were master blacksmiths, their skills passed down through generations. They worked with iron, bronze, and, most importantly, brass. The brass work of the Nub Kingdom was unique, a style that was both elegant and functional. They produced a variety of objects, from intricate ceremonial vessels and decorative plaques to functional items like bracelets and anklets. Their work was not just for the elite, it was an integral part of daily life, a testament to the fact that artistry and practicality could coexist. The kingdom's wealth was built on its control of trade and its mastery of metalwork. The Nub Kingdom was strategically located at a major crossroads of trade, with the Niger River serving as a major highway for commerce. They controlled the flow of goods from the northern savanna to the southern forests, trading in salt, kola nuts, and agricultural products. Their expertise in metalwork gave them a significant advantage. They were able to produce high-quality weapons and armor, which allowed them to maintain a powerful and well-equipped army. The Nub military was a formidable force. They were not just a military power, they were a military culture. Their warriors were highly disciplined and their leaders were master strategists. They were constantly at war with their neighbors, expanding their territory and demanding tribute. The kingdom was a patchwork of conquered territories and tributary states, all held together by the strength of its army and the efficiency of its administration. The Nub Kingdom's history, therefore, is a story of a civilization that was both artistic and militaristic, a people who could forge both beautiful works of art and powerful weapons of war. But this raises a fascinating, and deeply complex, question: could a kingdom built on both beauty and brutality maintain its balance? Was its artistic excellence a reflection of its power, or was it a quiet, enduring spirit that would outlast the violence and the conquests? The Nup Kingdom, with its unique blend of artistic and military prowess, seemed destined for greatness. At the head of this powerful state was the Etsu Nup, a monarch whose power was both political and military. The Etsu Nup was a king who commanded a formidable army and a patron who commissioned beautiful works of art. The kingdom was a highly centralized state, with a series of powerful chiefs and a well-organized bureaucracy that ensured the efficient collection of taxes and the maintenance of the army. The kingdom's power was a constant source of conflict with its neighbors. The Nup were constantly at war with the Yorubas to the south and the Hausas to the north. Their military campaigns were often brutal, and their army was a source of fear throughout the region. The kingdom's military expansion, however, was not without its consequences. The constant warfare drained its resources and created a deep-seated resentment among its conquered subjects. The kingdom, which had been built on conquest, was now facing the inevitable tensions between a powerful ruling class and its subjugated population. The final blow to the Nup Kingdom came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The British, with their growing colonial ambitions, saw the Nup Kingdom as a major obstacle to their plans for a centralized administration in the region. The British, with their superior military technology and their ruthless efficiency, were able to defeat the Nup army with relative ease. In 1901, the British formally took control of the kingdom, ending a long and glorious chapter of its history. The fall of the Nup Kingdom was a stark reminder that even the most powerful of empires, if their power is based on a single, outdated skill, are destined to fade. The Nup's mastery of traditional warfare was no match for the British rifles and machine guns. The kingdom, which had been a formidable military power for centuries, was now a mere province in a much larger, and far less sympathetic, empire. The legacy of the Nup Kingdom, however, is not one of failure. It is a story of a people who, for a time, were masters of their own destiny, and a testament to the enduring power of their artistry. This leads us to a final, and deeply reflective, question. In a world of constant change, what happens to a kingdom whose power is based on a unique skill when that skill is no longer relevant? And how does a people, who were once masters of their own fate, adapt to a new reality that is no longer in their control? The Nup Kingdom may have fallen to the forces of colonialism, but its legacy lives on in the art and the culture of its people. The kingdom's story is not a simple tale of a glorious rise and a tragic fall. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and the enduring power of a people's identity. The Nup people, who were once masters of their own destiny, were forced to adapt to a new reality under British colonial rule. They were no longer a dominant political or military force. They became a people who had to navigate a new system of governance, one that was alien to their traditions and their history. They were forced to abandon their reliance on warfare and to find new ways to survive in a world that was no longer defined by their military prowess. The legacy of the Nup Kingdom, however, is not found in grand monuments or a vast written history. It is found in the enduring skill of its artisans and in the quiet resilience of its people. The Nup, who were once a feared and powerful force, were now a minority group in a much larger, and far less sympathetic, empire. The story of the Nup Kingdom is a powerful counter-narrative to the more traditional histories of centralized empires. It shows us that history is not just about the grand rise and fall of kingdoms, but about the quiet, enduring resilience of a people. The Nup's mastery of brass work, which had once been a source of their wealth and power, became a symbol of their enduring cultural identity. The artists of Nup continued to produce beautiful works of art, even in the face of colonial rule. Their artistry was not just a historical curiosity, it was a way of preserving their culture and their history in a world that was changing around them. The story of the Nup Kingdom is a testament to the idea that the true measure of a people is not found in the empires they build or the battles they win, but in the beauty they create and the legacy they leave behind. Our historical journey now takes us to a city that, for 1,000 years, has been a vibrant, bustling crossroads of commerce and culture. We are in Kano, a city in the heart of what is now northern Nigeria, a place whose very existence is a testament to the power of trade and the quiet, enduring strength of a people. Kano was not a kingdom of warriors or priests, it was a city of merchants, scholars, and artisans, a place where the camel met the horse and the ideas of the world met the realities of the savannah. The city's most enduring symbol is the Great Wall of Kano, a massive earthen wall that, for centuries, protected the city from invaders and served as a physical manifestation of its power and prosperity. The wall, with its numerous gates, was a constant reminder that Kano was a city of commerce, a place that welcomed traders from all over the world. Kano's wealth was built on its strategic location at the southern end of the trans-Saharan trade routes. For centuries, caravans laden with gold, ivory, slaves, and salt from the north made their way to Kano, where they were traded for the products of the southern forests, such as kola nuts, cotton, and leather goods. Kano was the ultimate middleman, a city that controlled the flow of goods and information between the Sahara and the forest regions. The city's economy was not just based on trade, it was also a major center of production. The artisans of Kano were renowned for their expertise in a variety of crafts, from leatherwork and dyeing to weaving and pottery. The famous Kano indigo dye pits, which are still in use today, produced textiles of a deep, rich color that were sought after throughout the region. The city was a manufacturing powerhouse, a place where raw materials were transformed into finished goods that were sold all over the continent. The city's political structure was a sultanate, with a powerful sultan at its head. The sultan's power, however, was not absolute. It was checked by a powerful council of scholars and merchants, who ensured that the city's policies were always in line with the interests of its commercial elite. The sultan was a patron of the arts and a guardian of the city's traditions, but his primary role was to ensure the continued prosperity of the city. The story of Kano is a quiet, yet powerful, reminder that true power does not always reside in military might or spiritual authority. It can also be found in the relentless pursuit of commerce and the quiet, enduring strength of a people. But this raises a crucial, and deeply reflective, question: could a city built on the foundations of trade and commerce survive in a world that was becoming increasingly defined by war, conquest, and the brutal realities of colonialism? The city of Kano, with its impressive walls and its bustling markets, seemed destined to endure. Its wealth and its strategic location had made it a magnet for traders and scholars from all over the world. However, like all empires, it was eventually destined to collapse. The final chapter of Kano's history is a stark example of a commercial empire being dismantled by a force it could not comprehend or control: British colonialism. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British Empire's influence in the region was growing. The British saw Kano not as a vibrant city of commerce, but as a political entity that had to be brought under their control. The British, with their superior military technology and their insatiable appetite for land and resources, saw the city as a major obstacle to their plans for a centralized administration in the region. The British military campaign against Kano began in 1903. The British forces, with their superior firepower and their ruthless efficiency, were able to conquer the city with relative ease. The massive walls, which had protected the city for centuries, were no match for British artillery. The city's army, with its reliance on traditional weapons and its decentralized command structure, was unable to mount a coordinated defense. The Sultan, Alhaji Aliyu Baba, was captured and exiled, and the city was formally incorporated into the British Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. The fall of Kano was not just a military defeat, it was the end of a unique political and social experiment. The city, which had been built on the ideals of commerce and scholarship, was now a mere province in a much larger, and far less moral, empire. The British dismantled the city's political structure, replacing its traditional laws with their own. However, in a shrewd and pragmatic move, the British did not completely abolish the Sultanate. Instead, they adopted a system of indirect rule, in which they governed the territory through the existing traditional rulers, including the Sultan of Kano. This allowed them to maintain a semblance of order while still asserting their ultimate control. The legacy of Kano is a complex and enduring one. On one hand, it was an empire built on a foundation of commerce and intellectual revival. On the other, it was a state that was ultimately undone by the same forces that were reshaping the world. Its legacy lives on in the vibrant culture of the city, and in the enduring influence of its merchants and scholars. The city of Kano, though a lost empire, is a powerful reminder that even the most well-intentioned of movements can be undone by the relentless march of history, and that the line between a peaceful city and a conquered one can often be blurred. The city of Kano may have fallen to the forces of colonialism, but its legacy lives on in the art and the culture of its people. The city's story is not a simple tale of a glorious rise and a tragic fall. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and the enduring power of a people's identity. The people of Kano, who were once masters of their own destiny, were forced to adapt to a new reality under British colonial rule. They were no longer a dominant political or military force. They became a people who had to navigate a new system of governance, one that was alien to their traditions and their history. They were forced to abandon their reliance on commerce and to find new ways to survive in a world that was no longer defined by their trade. The legacy of Kano, however, is not found in grand monuments or a vast written history. It is found in the enduring skill of its artisans and in the quiet resilience of its people. The merchants of Kano, who were once a feared and powerful force, were now a minority group in a much larger, and far less sympathetic, empire. The story of the city of Kano is a powerful counter-narrative to the more traditional histories of centralized empires. It shows us that history is not just about the grand rise and fall of kingdoms, but about the quiet, enduring resilience of a people. The city's mastery of trade and commerce, which had once been a source of its wealth and power, became a symbol of its enduring cultural identity. The merchants of Kano continued to trade, even in the face of colonial rule. Their commerce was not just a historical curiosity, it was a way of preserving their culture and their history in a world that was changing around them. The story of the city of Kano is a testament to the idea that the true measure of a people is not found in the empires they build or the battles they win, but in the wealth they create and the legacy they leave behind. Our journey returns us now to the humid forests of Benin, but this time, we look at the kingdom through a different lens, the lens of a foreign power. We are in the late 15th century, a time of immense change and global exploration. The Portuguese, driven by a desire for gold, spices, and new converts to Christianity, were methodically sailing down the West African coast, establishing trading posts and making contact with the various kingdoms and city-states. Their arrival in Benin was not a violent conquest, but a quiet, almost tentative encounter between two powerful empires that, for a time, saw each other as equals. The first Portuguese to arrive in Benin were a group of merchants and sailors, led by the explorer João Afonso de Aveiro, in 1485. They were not met with hostility, but with curiosity and a cautious welcome. The Oba of Benin, a powerful and shrewd monarch, saw the Portuguese not as a threat, but as a potential source of wealth and power. He allowed them to establish a small trading post on the coast, and a relationship of mutual respect and commerce was slowly forged. The Portuguese, in turn, were deeply impressed by the city of Benin, its sophisticated political structure, and its vast walls. They wrote detailed accounts of the city, calling it Great Benin and marveling at its cleanliness and its well-organized society. The trade between the two empires was a unique and fascinating exchange. The Portuguese brought with them European goods, firearms, cloth, and, most importantly, brass and copper. The Bini, in turn, traded ivory, pepper, and slaves. The trade was controlled by the Oba, who maintained a strict monopoly on all commerce with the Europeans. He allowed the Portuguese to trade, but only on his terms. He saw them as just another tributary, a foreign power that had to be brought into the Benin system of trade and tribute. The Portuguese, in turn, saw the Oba as a powerful monarch and a potential ally. They sent him gifts of fine cloth and valuable goods, and they even sent him a series of priests in a failed attempt to convert him to Christianity. The Oba, ever the diplomat, allowed the priests to preach, but he never converted. He saw their religion as a fascinating curiosity, but he never abandoned his own. The encounter between Benin and Portugal was a testament to the quiet power of diplomacy and commerce. It was a relationship that was built on mutual respect and a shared desire for wealth. It was not a relationship of equals in the modern sense, but it was a relationship in which two empires, with their own unique worldviews and their own unique systems of power, were able to coexist and to benefit from each other. But this raises a crucial question: Would this quiet, peaceful relationship last, or would the very trade that brought them together be the source of their eventual conflict? The initial peaceful coexistence between Benin and Portugal was a fragile one, a delicate balance that was eventually shattered by the changing realities of the global economy. While the Oba had initially welcomed the Portuguese as just another trading partner, he soon realized that the Portuguese were not like the others. They were relentless in their pursuit of wealth, and their demands were constantly shifting. The trade, which had initially been a mix of ivory, pepper, and slaves, soon became dominated by a single commodity: human beings. The Portuguese, with their vast plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, had an insatiable demand for enslaved labor. The Oba, ever the pragmatist, was willing to meet this demand. He used his military to wage war against his neighbors, taking captives and selling them to the Portuguese. The trade was incredibly profitable, and the Oba used the wealth to strengthen his army and to commission a new series of bronze plaques, which now began to depict the Portuguese themselves, with their strange clothes and their foreign weapons. The bronze plaques of this period are a fascinating historical record of this shift. They show the Portuguese as a powerful, but subordinate, foreign force. They are depicted with their muskets and their cannons, but they are always shown in a position of deference to the Oba. This was a clear message from the Oba to his own people and to the world. He was in control of the relationship, and the Portuguese were simply his trading partners, not his superiors. However, the Portuguese were not the only European power in the region. The Dutch, the British, and the French soon followed, all vying for a share of the lucrative trade. The competition was fierce, and it led to a period of instability and conflict. The Oba, who had once been able to play the various European powers against each other, now found himself in a complex web of alliances and rivalries. The guns that he had so eagerly traded for were now being used against him, as his neighbors, armed with European weapons, began to challenge his authority. The peaceful encounter between Benin and Portugal had devolved into a complex and often brutal struggle for power. The Oba's obsession with bronze, which had once been a source of his artistic and cultural greatness, was now fueling a system of warfare and slavery that was tearing his kingdom apart. This leads us to a crucial, and deeply disturbing, question: could a kingdom, whose very existence was tied to the institution of slavery, survive in a world that was becoming increasingly defined by a new kind of power, the power of abolitionism and the relentless march of colonial expansion? The final act of the Benin-Portuguese encounter is a tragic one, a story of a kingdom that, having successfully navigated a monumental shift in its economy, was ultimately undone by the relentless march of colonialism. The British, with their growing colonial ambitions, saw Benin not as a powerful trading partner, but as a major obstacle to their plans for a centralized administration in the region. The British, with their superior military technology and their insatiable appetite for land and resources, saw the city as a major obstacle to their plans for a centralized administration in the region. In 1897, the British launched the punitive expedition against Benin, a military campaign that was a direct result of the long history of conflict and mistrust between the two empires. The British forces, with their superior firepower and their ruthless efficiency, were able to conquer the city with relative ease. The massive walls, which had protected the city for centuries, were no match for British artillery. The city's army, with its reliance on traditional weapons and its decentralized command structure, was unable to mount a coordinated defense. The Oba, Oven Ramlin, was captured and exiled, and the city was formally incorporated into the British Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. The fall of Benin was not just a military defeat, it was the end of a unique political and social experiment. The city, which had been built on the ideals of commerce and artistry, was now a mere province in a much larger, and far less moral, empire. The British dismantled the city's political structure, replacing its traditional laws with their own. However, in a shrewd and pragmatic move, the British did not completely abolish the kingdom. Instead, they adopted a system of indirect rule, in which they governed the territory through the existing traditional rulers, including the Oba of Benin. This allowed them to maintain a semblance of order while still asserting their ultimate control. The legacy of the Benin-Portuguese encounter is a complex and enduring one. On one hand, It was an empire built on a foundation of commerce and intellectual revival. On the other, it was a state that was ultimately undone by the same forces that were reshaping the world. Its legacy lives on in the religious and intellectual traditions of the region, and in the enduring influence of its founders. The Benin-Portuguese encounter, though a lost empire, is a powerful reminder that even the most well-intentioned of movements can be undone by the relentless march of history, and that the line between a peaceful city and a conquered one can often be blurred. Our historical journey now returns to the spiritual heart of the Yoruba world, the city of Ife. We have already explored its rise, its divine art, and its quiet, spiritual power. But like all civilizations, Ife's golden age was not to last forever. Its decline was not a result of a sudden, catastrophic event, but a slow, gradual fading of its spiritual authority in the face of a changing world. The story of Ife's decline is a quiet, yet poignant, reminder that even the most powerful of spiritual institutions can be undone by the relentless march of history. The power of Ife was built on a foundation of spiritual authority. The Uni, the spiritual head of the Yoruba people, was a figure of immense reverence, and his city was a place of pilgrimage and divine sanction. The art of Ife, with its serene, naturalistic sculptures, was a reflection of this spiritual power. It was a power that was not based on military might or economic dominance, but on a shared belief in the sanctity of the city and its divine ruler. However, as the 14th and 15th centuries drew to a close, new powers began to emerge in the region. The rise of the Oyo Empire, with its formidable cavalry and its militaristic political structure, was a direct challenge to Ife's spiritual authority. Oyo did not seek to conquer Ife, it sought to bypass it. The Oyo rulers, in their quest for political dominance, began to assert their own authority, and they no longer relied on the Uni's divine sanction to legitimize their rule. The spiritual power of Ife, which had once been so absolute, was now being challenged by a new, more secular form of power. The art of Ife, which had been a reflection of its spiritual authority, also began to change. The naturalistic style of the early sculptures gave way to a more stylized, less realistic form. The reasons for this change are complex and multifaceted, but they ultimately point to a society that was adapting to a new reality. The demand for the highly realistic, ritualistic art of Ife may have declined in favor of a more symbolic art form that was easier to produce and better suited for a new, more militaristic age. The delicate realism of the early period, which required immense skill and time, may have become impractical in a world that was shifting from a spiritual focus to a political one. This quiet, internal shift raises a crucial question. Did the golden age of Ife's art fade because the world around it changed, or did its artistic decline reflect a deeper loss of spiritual authority and a shift in the very soul of the Yoruba people? Was the change from realistic portraiture to more symbolic forms a symptom of a cultural decline, or a deliberate adaptation to a new set of values and beliefs? The decline of Ife's golden age was a slow, gradual process, a quiet shift in the cultural landscape of the Yoruba world. The reasons for this change are complex and multifaceted, but they ultimately point to a society that, in its spiritual and artistic focus, was unable or unwilling to adapt to the new realities of power in the region. The rise of military-focused states like Oyo meant that spiritual sanction, while still important, was no longer the sole source of political legitimacy. The final chapter of Ife's art story is not one of a dramatic end, but of a quiet transformation. The Ife artists did not disappear, their skills were simply redirected. The tradition of bronze casting, which they had perfected, was passed on to other kingdoms, most notably to Benin. While the Benin casters adopted the lost wax technique, they adapted it to their own cultural needs, creating a more stylized, symbolic, and historical art form. The Benin bronzes, with their detailed chronicles of military victories and royal power, are a direct descendant of Ife's artistry, but a far cry from its serene, naturalistic beauty. This transfer of knowledge is a powerful example of how culture and art can migrate, adapt, and evolve in new contexts. The legacy of Ife is not found in the grand walls of a lost empire, but in the spiritual heart of the Yoruba people. The city remains a sacred space, a place of pilgrimage and a source of divine authority. The Uni of Ife is still considered the spiritual head of the Yoruba, and the city continues to be a center of traditional rituals and ceremonies. The serene faces of the terracotta heads, now scattered in museums and collections around the world, are more than just art. They are a physical manifestation of a spiritual ideal that has endured for a millennium. The story of Ife teaches us a powerful lesson about the nature of power and influence. It shows us that a civilization can be profoundly influential without a massive army or a vast empire. Its power came from its spiritual authority and its artistic genius, a kind of cultural and religious soft power that shaped the identity of an entire people. The sculptures of Ife, in their tranquil realism, are a testament to a society that saw the divine in the human and the sacred in the mundane. The fading of this golden age was not a failure, but a quiet evolution. The tradition of sacred art continued, but in a different form. It moved away from individual portraits and towards more symbolic representations of power and spirituality. The art of Ife reminds us that the history of a people is not just about their triumphs and their battles, but about their beliefs, their rituals, and the quiet, enduring power of their artistic expression. The legacy of Ife is the legacy of a people who believed that the true measure of a civilization lay not in the size of its walls, but in the beauty of its soul. The decline of Ife's golden age was a gradual process, but the final, decisive blow to its political independence came with the arrival of the British. The British, with their growing colonial ambitions, had little use for a kingdom whose power was based on spiritual authority and ritual. They saw the fragmented political landscape of the Yoruba region as an opportunity to impose their own centralized form of rule. While the British did not launch a punitive expedition against Ife as they did against Benin, they systematically undermined the authority of the Uni and the traditional chiefs. They imposed their own legal system, their own taxes, and their own form of governance. The Uni, who had for centuries been a powerful spiritual leader, was now relegated to being a mere traditional ruler with no real political power. The city, which had been a sacred space for a millennium, was now just another town in the British Protectorate of Nigeria. The legacy of Ife, however, is not one of a total loss. The city remains a sacred space, a place of pilgrimage and a source of spiritual authority for the Yoruba people. The Uni is still a revered figure, and the city continues to be a center of traditional rituals and ceremonies. The serene faces of the terracotta heads, now scattered in museums and collections around the world, are more than just art. They are a physical manifestation of a spiritual ideal that has endured for a millennium. The story of Ife is a quiet tragedy. It is the story of a civilization that, in its gentle, non-violent nature, was unable to survive a world that was becoming increasingly defined by war, conquest, and the brutal realities of colonialism. Its legacy, however, is not one of failure, but of a profound and enduring ideal. The kingdom of Ife left behind no great walls, no massive armies, and no vast empire.